to start off today's teaching, I want to ask a quick question, just by a show of hands. Who here in the room is married? If you're married, go ahead and raise your hand. All right, some of y'all are like a little too slow. You need to be more excited than that. I'm married, all right? All right, and who here isn't married, but who here wants to be married one day? Go ahead and raise your hand, raise your hand. Raise it nice and high, Everyone look around, make eye contact. This is your moment. Hook up. All right, there we go. Woo, your story starts today. All right, that's beautiful. All right, so now last question by a show of hands. Who here wants to get married but also plans to get a divorce? Oh, no one. I'll give another second. Anybody? Shocking. Nobody raised their hand. Actually, it's not shocking at all, right? No one raised their hand because no one on their wedding day has ever or will ever stand at the altar when the officiant says, do you take this man or woman to be your lawfully wedded wife or husband till death do us part? There has never been a day, there's never been a bride or groom who responds to that question instead of saying, I do, saying, meh, let's just wait and see what happens. There's never been a wedding where they're asked, do you take them till death do us part? And the person says till death do us part. That's a really long time. I didn't know that was the commitment we were making today. So why don't we give it a year or two, and if it doesn't work out, we'll just kind of burn the thing to the ground. No one has ever said that, will ever say that. You'll never go to that wedding. And so the reality of the matter is that no one plans to get a divorce. But the problem is that very few people actually have a plan on how not to get a divorce. And that's what I want to talk about today. And in fact, I wrote this message, and I'm like, this is more than a 1-week talk. We need to spread this out the next couple weeks. And so this is like a series within the series. This is the first part of it, of a message I'm calling How to Not Get a Divorce. And we need to talk about this because right now in America, a little over 50% of marriages today end in divorce. Now, whenever the topic of divorce comes up, some might say, Travis, there are some situations where divorce is the right option, to which I would say, you're right. There are situations where getting a divorce is the right option. In fact, there are biblical grounds for divorce in certain scenarios, but I would suggest that those situations are far more the minority than the majority of situations. In fact, according to a survey that was released this year, talking about divorces so far in 2023, and by the way, the annual average of divorces in America is 1 million couples a year. 1 million couples a year, on average, get divorced. If you're wondering what kind of industry that is, the wedding industry in America makes $51 billion a year on average. The divorce industry has made up to $175 billion. So it's a massive industry, because divorces are happening all the time. And in 2023, I found this particularly interesting, that of the million or so on average that will get divorced in 2023, right now, according to this survey, 5%, only 5% of those who have gotten divorced said they got divorced because their marriage was beyond repair. Only 5%. Which means 95% of a million couples who are getting divorced, 95%, they're not getting divorced because the marriage is beyond repair. They're getting a divorce because they don't know how, and this is probably an oversimplification, but they don't know how to move forward. They don't have a plan to restore what has been broken and to fight for their marriage. And so over the next couple weeks, I want to teach you how to be the kind of person that fights for their marriage. I want to talk about what it means to have a plan on how not to get a divorce. Because as I said, no one, when they get married, plans to get a divorce. The issue is very few people have a plan on how not to get a divorce. And so today we need to talk about this. And by the way, if you're not married, I think if you're married, you're like, oh, this is really relevant. But if you're not married, you might be like, oh, is this relevant? Absolutely it is. Because you prepare for marriage before you walk down the aisle, not after. It's not wisdom to say, I'll figure out the marriage thing, I'll think about it a little bit more after I get married. Don't do that. So this is actually a great conversation for you to start, because I'm just gonna guess that none of you in this room are like, yeah, if I get divorced, I get divorced, whatever. None of you are thinking that. None of you want that. That's not the dream, and that's not what winning in your relationships looks like. And so we need to talk about a hard thing to talk about. here at Canvas, and we'll do that over the next couple of weeks. So Jesus, he's having this conversation with a group of religious leaders called the Pharisees. And the Pharisees, they asked Jesus, what's your take on divorce? Because 2,000 years ago, this was a very contentious topic. And there were a lot of different perspectives on when you can get a divorce, when you cannot get a divorce. What does the Hebrew scriptures have to say about all this? And so they sort of bickered back and forth about this. And so the Pharisees come to Jesus saying, well, if you're a rabbi, tell us your take on it. And here's what Jesus says in Matthew 19. He says, some Pharisees came and tried to trap him with this question. Should a man be allowed to divorce his wife for just any reason? Haven't you read the scriptures? Jesus replied. They record that from the beginning, God made them male and female. And he said, this explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united into one. Since they are no longer two but one, let no one split apart what God has joined together. Then why did Moses say in the law that a man could give his wife a written notice of divorce and send her away? And Jesus replied, Moses permitted divorce only as a concession to your hard hearts, but it was not what God had originally intended. If you're going to underline something, you're going to highlight something, maybe highlight that. It is not what God had originally intended. And I tell you this, whoever divorces his wife and marries someone else commits adultery unless his wife has been unfaithful. So Jesus is asked by this religious sect called the Pharisees, hey, what's your take on divorce? When is it allowed? When is it not allowed? When is it okay? When is it not okay? Here's what Moses says, but we want to know, what do you say? And by the way, they're trying to trap Jesus, and Jesus surprises them with their answer. And Jesus says there's really not a whole lot of reasons to support divorce, and here is the reason why. And this is the point that I would come back to, because we could have a lot of thoughts and conversations on what Jesus said here. But if we miss this main point, then we're going to miss the heartbeat of what Jesus says about marriage and divorce in this important conversation. Jesus says it in verse 8. He says, but it, meaning divorce, was not what God had originally intended. We can have conversations on divorce. We can, have a nuanced conversation on it and what the Bible might say about it and what that means for our lives here in 2023. But there's one thing that Jesus made abundantly clear when he's asked this question about divorce and marriage. And Jesus makes it clear that divorce was not what God had originally intended. This is not God's plan A for your relationship. This is not God's plan A for your marriage. God did not intend for you to get a divorce. And so today I want to talk about what does it look like to make a plan to protect the intentions that God had for your marriage or for your future marriage that you're in. How do you have a plan not to get a divorce? Because God wants you to win in your relationships more than I do. God wants you to win in your marriage more than even I do. God's intention for you is to have a healthy, lasting marriage. And to start off this 2-week mini-series on how not to get divorced, I want to talk about something that, I'll be honest, I don't want to talk about it. I want to talk about something I don't want to talk about. I need to talk about something that I've never talked about in a church before. So you're going to hear it first today. But it's something that not only do I not want to talk about, but we need to talk about it. And I've never talked about it, but all of us need to hear about it. And that is the topic of how do you make your marriage or future marriage affair-proof? Today, I want to talk a little bit about this heavy, destructive, and far too common word happening in many of our relationships, and that is infidelity. And how do we not only have a plan not to get divorced, but how do we have a marriage or future marriage that is affair-proof? Now, again, some of us maybe in the room are already thinking to ourselves, Travis, my marriage, that would never happen to my marriage. It might happen to somebody else's marriage. Let me tell you about this couple. It's probably going to happen to them, but not us, Travis. I would never cheat. They would never cheat. Or maybe you're single and you're like, I would never date a cheater. As if people plan to have an affair. As if those who experienced it, this was all part of the game plan. No, it never was. In fact, I would say it is those who assume that it would never happen to them that they become like the perfect candidates for it to happen to them. But it is those who say, it could happen to me. I could be the cheater and I could be cheated on. I could have a marriage that starts strong but never finishes because it's broken due to infidelity. See, there's a posture that changes when you say that about yourself and you own that as a possibility, because instead of assuming it won't ever happen to you and putting down your guard, instead you assume it could happen to me. And you start creating a plan and a path forward. In fact, Proverbs chapter 16 says this: the pride comes before destruction, an arrogant spirit before a fall. Let's apply it today. The marriage that says it will never, ever, ever end in divorce is the one that often experiences destruction. And it is the person or couple that says, oh, we would never have an affair. That could never happen to me. That's the sort of spirit that if you're not careful, it'll lead you to the very fall you say would never, ever happen to you. And so how do we make our marriage affair-proof? This is heavy, I hear it. And we're gonna lean in a little bit because we're a church that talks about hard things. So we're gonna talk about this. How do you make your marriage affair-proof? If you're taking notes, so this is a real practical message. I would love you to write this down. Married, single, write it down. First thing is this: do whatever it takes to radically reduce the risks. Do whatever it takes to radically reduce the risks. Far too many couples, they do the bare minimum. But I'm asking you to go further than the bare minimum. I'm not even just asking you, will you reduce the risks? But what does it look like for you to radically reduce the risk of having an affair in your marriage or having a marriage that's postured for that sort of destructive path? And let me give you a few ideas of what this could look like, what it looks like to radically reduce the risks of having an affair in your marriage. The first is this: keep a growing relationship with Jesus. Keep a growing relationship with Jesus. Some of you are like, well, isn't that obvious? You would think, but it's not happening in a lot of relationships. You want to know a sad fact? People in the church who say they're following Jesus get divorced as much as those who are not followers of Jesus. So we still haven't quite figured this out yet. And the thing is, I would encourage you, I would implore you to consider is, are you growing together in your relationship with Jesus? And I'm asking more than, do you go to church together on Sundays? Because if the only time you talk about Jesus or have any sort of spiritual space or time together is at church, it's not enough. And I want to implore you, I want to invite you to consider, what does it mean to go further, to grow in your relationship with Jesus? Pray for your spouse. It's really hard to cheat on someone you're praying for all the time. Pray for your spouse. Pray with your spouse. When was the last time you actually prayed with your spouse, where they came to you and said, man, I'm feeling stressed out. I'm anxious. I'm mad. My boss is a monster. I mean, how often do we go, oh, that's so awful, honey. I just feel so bad that you're going through that. Not a bad response. What would it look like to go further and say, can we pray together right now? I'm going to wring my kid's neck. Yep, we need to pray right now. Let's just pray for peace and calm, right? Like, when was the last time you prayed with your spouse? Serve your spouse. Serve with your spouse. Go to church with your spouse. Be a part of a small group with your spouse. It does need to be more than sitting in a seat on Sunday. What does it look like for you to grow in your relationship with your spouse? Like, when was the last time you had and I don't say this to shame anybody. Jenna and I are not perfect. You want like true, honest to God reality for Jenna and I's relationship? We've been married 16 years. It took us 17 years. Oh my gosh. That's embarrassing. All right, 17 years. And we've been married a long time. And it took us 4 years, and we were full-time pastors. 4 years to start praying together. Like, you can judge me all you want. I get it. Like, I know it doesn't always come naturally, but I'm telling you, something that changed our marriage was when we started praying with one another, and now nearly every day we do. And it changed our marriage. Keep a growing relationship with Jesus if you want to radically reduce the risk. Here's the next one. Have clear boundaries with people of the opposite sex. I wrote this down and I thought, man, there's going to be some people in the room. They're like, Travis, you're so out of date. Having boundaries with people of the opposite sex. Come on, what are you, 80? Like, what is this advice that you're asking? Okay, well, let me just tell you, as someone who's been married for a long time, you need to have boundaries as a married couple with people of the opposite sex. You want to radically reduce the risk of having an affair in your marriage? Here's a boundary. I'm never alone with someone of the opposite sex that isn't my spouse. Like, you're not going to have an affair if that is a rule for you. Unless, like, you're having an affair in public in which you're a real freak. But most affairs happen in private. And some people are like, but Travis, they're like family. They're really good friends. This person, that would never happen. Can I tell you, as someone who's had to walk through a lot of couples having through this situation, it's very rarely that they're like, I had an affair with a total stranger. It's usually someone who's in your orbit, someone who might even be seen as a really good friend, someone you might have even trusted, and you let your guard down, and lines started to get crossed, and an affair happens. I'm not saying you have to do this, but I'm saying can you ever overprotect your marriage? I don't think you can, but I sure think you can underprotect it. And the price to pay for that is always steep. And now when I wrote this, I had even a couple voices in my head of people that I know I've had this conversation with where I was like, hey, I think you need to have some clear lines about who you're with, who you're not, where, when, all that stuff. And they're like, Travis, that's so stupid. These people in my head, I'm thinking about, that's so stupid. And I can tell you with 100% truth that both people that I'm thinking of right now that told me how stupid I was for this rule both had an affair. So I'm telling you, if you want to radically reduce the risk of an affair in your marriage, have boundaries. I mean, when was the last time you sat down with your spouse? Like, what is the boundary? Like, what is the line here? What boundaries do we have? Scripture in Proverbs says like a city without walls is, it's just set up to be destroyed. A city without some sort of boundaries, it's just prime to be picked apart. So the third thing I would say is this: don't talk bad about your spouse. How do you radically reduce the risks in your marriage? Like, don't talk bad about your spouse. Right? And let me just preface this, because Jenna and I, we talked about this message, and she made a good point that I think is true. It's this, you need to have a person you can go to, because guess what? Your spouse is going to drive you nuts sometimes. Like all my single people that think it's just like white picket fences and we never argue. No, let's wait till you get married. If anything, your fights will be like crazy sometimes with your spouse because there's so much trust there, but you're going to fight. And I'm not saying you don't have anybody that you don't go to in your life that say, man, we're going through a tough season. You need to have those people. We'll talk about that in a moment. But there is a very clear difference between I'm processing what's going on in a productive, healthy way, and somebody who every time they show up, my husband, blah, 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 right? Like, you know that person, right? Oh, my wife. Oh, let me just tell you, blah, 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 blah. And they're just always ripping on their spouse, always telling you what's wrong with them, never telling you what's right with them. When was the last time you with your friends, you just kept going about what's right with your spouse? I mean, it's easy to pick out what's wrong. And you know what? Let me just take it a step further since we're doing that today. Like, if your spouse heard how you talked about them when they're not in the room, would their spirits be lifted or crushed? Like, how you talk about your spouse when they're not in the room matters. Guess what? Because you often will get what you expect. And so if you're constantly talking about how terrible they are, what a frustrating person they are, don't be surprised if they continue being terrible and frustrating. Because you've already set the tone for your relationship. You've already set the expectations for what you're going to see when you go home. And oftentimes people grow into the expectations you give them. What would it look like for you to offer them high expectations, to speak life and identity and purpose and meaning? I'm not saying that you don't ever tell them when they do something wrong. You can do that. But do you ever tell them when they do things right? And I don't know about you, I want to tell Jenna more what's right about her than what's wrong about her. I've never seen a healthy marriage when they're like, what's your secret? Oh man, we just rip each other apart all the time. You know, we just let nothing slide. Like whenever they mess up, they hear it. Never seen a healthy outcome from that. So don't talk bad about your spouse. James, the brother of Jesus, he says this, and I think it's wisdom. He says, in the same way, the tongue is a small thing that makes grand speeches, but a tiny spark can set a great forest on fire. Makes me wonder what fires exist in our marriage simply because you did not get control of the words that you said. Another thing is this: surround yourself with others you want to be like. You want to radically reduce the risk? Surround yourself with others that you want to be like. And this is supported by tons and tons and tons of data that you will likely become the average of the people you hang out with the most. You want to be healthy? Hang out with healthy people. You want to grow in your business leadership? Hang with other leaders of business that are going where you want to go. If you want to have deeper faith, hang out with people who are growing in their faith. And if you want to have a healthy marriage, hang out with people who have a healthy marriage. And you become like those you hang out with the most. So if you're single or dating and you want to have a healthy marriage, get a married couple in your life. In fact, I would say there's 3 categories of people that if we had each box filled, we would be well-rounded in our lives. And the 3 is this: a peer, a parent, and a grandparent. So who do you have in your life as a married couple or even a single person is a peer? They're in the same lane, same season of life. They can relate to you. They can empathize with you. We all need peers. Most of us stop at peers. But you can't learn much from your peers because they're not ahead of you. They've not experienced things that you have not experienced. That's why you need a parent. I'm not talking about your literal parents. If you have great parents, awesome. But I'm talking about people who are like 10 to 20 years down the road. They've been married and they've lived a lot longer. They've been married a bit longer. Like, get those people in your corner if they have a healthy marriage and say, hey, like, could you mentor us? But you want to go even further, and this is super rare. Do you have someone in your life that they're not your peer parent, they're your grandparent? Like, they've been married for 40 years and they still hold hands with their wife or their husband. Like, they have a healthy marriage after decades and decades and decades of marriage. Those are the people you take them out to dinner and say, tell us what you're doing. Tell us what works. We want to be your best friend. And I guarantee you, you will have a healthier marriage if you surround yourself with healthy marriages. 4th is this: don't play with fire. Don't play with fire. In 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 22, it's this interesting verse where the author, he's talking about sin, and he says you need to flee from sin. You need to run from sin. He doesn't go like, get as close to the line as you can. If you feel a little heat, it's fine. He's like, no. Run, flee. The Greek word that is used here in this verse is fugo. Everyone say fugo, which I love it because it's like when you get near sin, fugo, like go the other way. Run the other direction. You get a text message from a coworker that your gut is telling you is not appropriate. You don't text back, fool, go. You're at a work conference and your coworker who's not your spouse says, hey, can we go out for a couple of drinks? Just want to hang out. It's 11 at night, 12 at night. Fool, go the other way. Get as far away as you can from the fire, from the heat. Because I'll tell you what, man, and this breaks my heart. And some of you know this is true. I cannot tell you how many businessmen, and I'm sure this applies to women as well, but I will just say from my own experience, it's come only from businessmen so far. I've heard again and again from different people how it is normal that a man goes on a business trip who's married and takes his ring off for the trip. Some girls are like, not my man. I'm a super glue that to his finger. Like, so some of you are like, Travis, this is just, come on, man. This is not how people work. This is not how the world works. Are you called to be of this world or not? Like, as a follower of Jesus, I'm talking to you as a follower of Jesus in this room. Are we called to be just like spiritual upgrades to the rest of the world, or actually a different way of living, a better way of living, a kingdom way of living? It may be normal to take off your wedding ring. It may be normal to have, it's just a text message. It's just a DM. It's just a friendly conversation. It's just a pat on the back. I'm just being there for them right now. Like, that might all be normal, but I'm telling you, if let's just say this, you work at a job where you have a toxic culture where everyone's just having affairs on one another and it's just normal. You want my advice? Get a new job. You know what's harder than finding a new job? Building a marriage that blows up. Because you got sucked into a culture that led nowhere good. So how do you radically reduce the risks of having an affair? These are some good places to start, but how else do you make your marriage affair-proof? The second way I'd say is invest in the intimacy of your marriage. Invest in the intimacy of your marriage. I use that word intentionally, invest. You ain't gonna get no return if you never make an investment. Invest in the intimacy of your marriage. Get alone, get spiritual, get deep, get spontaneous, get naked, whatever you need to do. Invest in every layer of intimacy in your marriage. And I didn't just mention sex. I mentioned a whole lot else than that because intimacy is far more nuanced than just physical contact with one another. In fact, if you're wondering why your physical intimacy is lacking and there's no return on that, perhaps it's because there's no spiritual, intellectual, or relational intimacy being invested. Right? So how do you invest in the intimacy of your marriage? You got to be intentional about it because what you feed lives and what you starve dies. Right? It's the basic principle of all that is alive. What you feed lives, what you starve dies. If you feed intimacy, it lives. If you starve intimacy, it dies. What you feed lives, what you starve dies. It's not mind-blowing, and yet it is one of these basic principles we often forget in healthy relationships. We're like, what's going on in my relationship? Why is it so hollow and unhealthy and empty? And be like, well, when was the last time, I don't know, you complimented your spouse? Oh, that's not my thing, or when was the last time you went on a date? Oh, we got a kid. When was the last time you invested in the intimacy of your relationship? This is why it's frustrating even, I would say, when somebody comes to me and says, hey, Travis, we're going to get a divorce. And I'm like, well, what? Why? Why are you going to get a divorce? Oh, we just fell out of love. Do you know how crazy that is? Like getting a divorce because you run out of love is like buying a new car because you ran out of gas. Can you imagine being like, hey, Bob, new car? Yeah, you'll never believe it. Ran out of gas. Just went to the dealership right after that. Huh. No, when your car runs out of gas, what do? Say it out loud. You fill it up. Fill it up. And when your marriage runs out of love, what do? Fill it up. And as cheesy as this metaphor may be, I think when it comes to a healthy marriage relationship, your partner has a love tank, and you've got to fill up the love tank, all right? It's not their job to fill up their own love tank. You got to fill that up, and they fill it up for you. When it's empty, fill it up. Fill it up. In fact, this is what happens in Genesis. When Jesus references the creation story and the story of Adam and Eve, he says this. He says, this explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife, and the two are united. Everyone say united. The two are united into one. Now, a lot of times when we read that, we just think that's just like a PG-13 word of they had sex, but that word actually means something far more powerful. It's this Hebrew word debak. Everyone say debak. Debak. And debak means to cling to or to catch by pursuit. To pursue with affection and devotion. So when the creation story says Adam and Eve, they were united into one, they were debak. What they were saying is their relationship was full of pursuit. They clung to one another, pursuing one another with affection and devotion. The same word debak is used in Psalm 63, verse 8, where it says, my soul follows close behind you. Which is kind of a stalker verse, if we're honest. It sounds a little creepy, but that's the image of debak. It's this whoo, I'm pursuing you. I'm coming after you, girl. Oh, I'm gonna get you. I'm gonna catch you. I'm chasing after you. There's this pursuit in their relationship. And what we see in a lot of relationships is that you get married and the pursuit just dries up. And you don't know this because before you got married, pursuit was easy because you're still trying to prove something to one another. Then you get married and pursuit, you have to get a little bit more intentional about it. Or let's go even further, you have kids. You want to talk about something that will jack up pursuit in your marriage? Kids are awesome, but they have a way of making that a little bit more difficult. Pursuit doesn't get easier, it gets harder as you are married even longer. And this is why, a lot of times I'll counsel married couples and we'll be talking about pursuit and what's going on. And they're like, oh, we haven't been on a date in like for some couples, true story, like years. We haven't been on a date in years. I'm like, oh my gosh, why? Like, why have you been on a date? Well, little Timmy, he needs us to be by his bedside for him to go to sleep. And so like we cannot leave. Oh, Timmy, what would he do? He wouldn't sleep. And we just love little Timmy. And I hear this story. I'm like, you know what Timmy needs more than a really good one night of sleep? Little Timmy needs parents who love each other. Little Timmy needs parents who show little Timmy what it's like to be in a healthy, passionate, pursuit-filled relationship. And so I think little Timmy will recover from a bad night of sleep, but you know what's really hard to recover from? When he gets raised in a home where his parents are together but might as well be single. Like we see it again and again and again. One of the greatest gifts you'll give your kids is not a college scholarship, and it is not a car. It is a healthy marriage. It's the greatest gift you can give your kid. In a healthy marriage, you're taking notes. In a healthy marriage, pursuit is a priority. Pursuit is a priority. If you're too busy to pursue, you're too busy with probably things that you need to be less busy with. Pursuit is a priority in a healthy marriage. How do you make your marriage affair proof? You radically reduce the risks. Then you invest in the intimacy of your marriage. And this last point is the point I'll end on, but it's the hardest one of all. And this one has torn me apart this week, even thinking through it. If you want to radically reduce the risk and make your marriage affair proof, you need to visualize the destruction of divorce. You want to make your marriage affair proof? I would say you need to get a clear visual in your mind of what will happen if you get divorced and if you have an affair. Get a clear visual in your head. Proverbs chapter 5, verse 3. This is called the wisdom literature for a reason. And in the wisdom literature, it says this: for the lips of an immoral woman, and oftentimes this immoral woman is sort of a metaphor for sin, by the way. It says, for the lips of an immoral woman are as sweet as honey, and her mouth is smoother than oil. But in the end, she is as bitter as poison, as dangerous as a double-edged sword. Her feet go down to death. Her steps lead straight to the grave. See, what stood out to me as I read that this week is that line, but in the end. Woo, it's sweet at first. Oh, it's fun. Gets your heart beating a little bit. Feels good. But in the end, it only leads to destruction. I don't know how it might start. It starts a variety of ways. It could start with just an innocent little text message. Just a couple drinks. They were good friends. We're there for them. It's fine that my spouse isn't there. It starts really innocent. And yet, in the end, if you're not careful, it could lead to the very place you said you would never go in your marriage. Men in the room, do you have a visual of what would happen if you chose to go down that road? Men, do you have a visual of what it would be like to sit down with your wife, to look her in the eyes, and to tell her, I have betrayed you in perhaps the deepest way anyone could betray another human being. And I have broken the promise I made to you at our wedding day. Women in the room, do you have a visual of what it would be like to sit down with your kids, to sit down and have to explain to them why mom and dad are no longer going to be together anymore? To look in your kids' eyes, the same eyes that look to you as their example, and to tell them that their relationship with mom and dad is now going to forever change. And it wasn't because of anything they did. It was because of everything you did. Do you have a visual of what this would look like? I can tell you right now, I've not ever cheated on my wife, Jenna, because I have a very clear visual of what would happen if I did. First, as a pastor, I would single-handedly drag the name of Jesus through the mud. And not only that, if I stood here on the stage and I told each and every one of you, I confessed that I cheated on my wife, for many of you, you would leave the church. For some of you, you might even leave your faith. But there's something even worse. I have a visual. If I ever, and it's hard for me to even go there. If I ever cheated on Jenna, that I would look her in the eyes and I would say the words that I know would crush her at the deepest level, that would take years for her to recover if she did. And then I would have to sit down my daughter, Finley, and I would have to explain to her that Dad lied to her. Because I told Finley that she's the most important thing to me, but it turns out she actually isn't. Instead, meeting my own needs and satisfying my own selfish desires. Sorry, Finley, that actually was more important than you. Can you see how when you get a visual like this, things get real clear? The path forward becomes real. And if you want to affair-proof your marriage, you might want to get a visual of what would happen if you start walking down sin's doorsteps and make that decision. If the band wants to come up. Now, I went into this message today going like, gosh, this is heavy. It's been heavy on me all week. That's why these emotions, I just feel it because I hate divorce. I've seen so much of it. How about you? I hate affairs. I hate it with everything that's in me because I've heard the cries of partners who've heard the news and were crushed by it. And it is a cry that only comes from the soul. It is a cry that only comes from a place in your life that has died. I hate that cry, and I never want to hear that cry in any of you. And because of that, I want to have a hard talk about a hard topic. But I do know this, that for some of you, and I can tell already, some of you in this room, this hits at a very deep and personal level. You came to church today not expecting these things to come to the surface, maybe. But here we are. And maybe one is because you were betrayed. Maybe you're here and you know exactly what I'm talking about, that soul cry, because you have been betrayed before. And if that is you, I want to end today by telling you God grieves with those who grieve. And there has been no tear that you have ever cried that has been lost on God. And God is with you and walking with you and will continue to walk with you towards your healing. If I can tell you, you may not believe it, but please hear it and try and believe it. It's not over for you yet. The wound will heal. God is with you. But maybe you're here. You're not the betrayed, but you're the betrayer. You've committed adultery. You've cheated on someone that you said you would never, ever cheat on. I want to tell you today, and I mean this with all my heart, that your sin might be great, but God's love is greater. Your sin may be great, but God's grace is greater. And it's not over for you as well. I don't know about you, but I'm grateful that God doesn't hold me to my lowest moments. And He doesn't hold you to yours either. There is enough grace and love in God's heart for you. And maybe you've betrayed someone and it's actually still a secret. And Maybe even someone watching this later is gonna watch this and they know that there's a secret. And I'm telling you, I'm imploring you, I'm begging you to get it out into the light, to confess. And I don't know what happens on the other side of your confession, but I do know this: it's impossible to build a healthy marriage when you're building it on deceit. It is impossible to build a healthy marriage if you're building it on lies. Get it out into the open, because you'll never heal from that which you're not even willing to reveal. In your marriage, because I've seen it, by the grace of God, God can meet us in even the most difficult, excruciating, heart-wrenching moments. And God can make us brand new as a result. Because even when we're not faithful, God is faithful. Let me just say it again, and then we'll pray. Even when we're not faithful, God is always